Thanks a lot. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm going to present in this lecture an overview of pharmaceutical regulation and its role for incentivizing innovation. And what is a bit particular in my overview is that I'm going to stress from an international perspective the role of different regulations, which is not usually focus of research. And in particular, the fact that each country, each region has its own regulatory rules, has its own policies to incentivize innovation, to regulate the use of pharmaceuticals. And this has some impact overall on different countries. So first, as an introduction, I want to remind you that pharmaceutical R&D produce knowledge and global public goods that result in innovation. And we have seen a lot of innovation since a century with improved life quality, improved life expectancy. However, the healthcare markets vary a lot across countries. They differ by regulations, by different insurance structures, pharmaceutical policies, and we could go into many details, and health economists know how much institutions matter and how much they are different across countries, and it's very complex, and you can have specific rules in France, specific rules in Czech Republic, in the European Union, in the US, and this matters a lot. And so firms adjust their R&D investment, adjust their policies, they adjust timing, launch of drugs, they adjust pricing, they adjust supply in response to all these policies. Okay, so you have international companies who have these new novel therapies, and they have to decide what to do given the context of international regulations. So it's important to have a broader view about an international perspective. So there is a lot of research focused on the US, because of course the US policy is very important, the US market is the largest market, but it's not sufficient, and it's important, especially from a European point of view, to have this international perspective, to understand the role of all these regulations and policies in innovation. And so this is quite important, especially currently, given the policies that you see in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, the Most Favored Nation policies, etc. But also at the European level, we have seen with the COVID crisis the need for having European coordination, and I will talk also a little bit about that. So first, just to give you an idea about what I'm going to talk about, first I will present you some evidence to remind that pharmaceutical innovation is a public good and how it diffuses, the challenge for this diffusion. And then I will talk about the financing of innovation. I will give you some characteristics of R&D, the different policies that we classify usually in terms of push and pull incentives. And then I will talk about the international dimension and strategic interdependence, which has been overlooked up to now. And this implies that there are spillovers. Some spillovers are local, others are international. And this creates correlations across countries in terms of, for example, prices and launch orders, but also in terms of the rate of innovation according to market size. So first, pharmaceutical innovation is a public good. It's kind of obvious, but healthcare innovation brings medical breakthrough. It can benefit many people without depleting the individual use. So you get to invent some vaccine, for example. This invention is going to be a public good that can diffuse relatively fast. The diffusion is relatively easy in general because usually you can replicate the therapy, the drugs, without reinvesting in the huge discovery cost. You just have to pay for marginal cost. And in many cases, they are small. There are some, contrary to small molecules, there are some advanced therapies where marginal costs are high. And they raise some new challenges that I will also talk about, and that may also affect the diffusion rate of innovation. Okay? In the case of small molecules, where the marginal cost of production is very small, once you have paid for all the discovery, the diffusion just depends on the ability to replicate those marginal costs. In the case of advanced therapies, where marginal costs of production can still remain very high, it's going to be a challenge for example, poor countries to access those innovative treatments, because even if they don't invent them, even if they don't need to pay for the billions of R&D, they will have difficulties financing the marginal cost of those innovations. So the other thing that I wanted to say is that overall countries have similar healthcare needs. And so you really need to have an international perspective, because if the healthcare needs were segmented by countries and the policies were segmented by countries, you would not have a concern about the fact that the innovation is a public good. And so because the healthcare needs are similar, in fact, the public good innovation that we need in any country or any region is very much the same as in other regions. Okay? So, of course, there are some specificities, like developing countries that could have some specific epidemiological needs, but otherwise, you have a lot of correlations in those needs. So there is a lot of innovation in healthcare, and it has generated a lot of welfare gains, increased life expectancy, better quality of life, reduced mortality. I will not have time to describe all the figures we could find, but there is evidence that pharmaceutical innovation explains part of these improvements. So it's not the only source, but there are several papers, including paper by Frank Lichtenberg, that show that the pharmaceuticals have an important share in the medical progress. And for example, between 1990 and 2015, so relatively recently, life expectancy in the US has increased by more than 3 years. And we estimate that about 1/3 of it is due to pharmaceuticals. Okay, so there are also, of course, other reasons for improved life expectancy, but pharmaceuticals matter. The diffusion of those improvements clearly can be shown with these graphs, where you see the life expectancy at birth since 1960 on different regions, different countries. And so what I have chosen here on this graph is to show exactly the fact that this is growing everywhere, even in countries or regions that do not pay for R&D, that do not do research and do not invent those drugs, where during that time period, mostly this is coming from the US and Europe and Japan, and a little bit of China since recently. But basically, India, Africa, you see their life expectancy growing, and there is evidence that part of it is also due to new vaccine, new treatments. So this is due to the effect of diffusion. Sometimes with lag, but there is diffusion of this innovation, even in countries that don't invest in R&D because they are yet too poor to do that. There is also some evidence in terms of, for example, just in the US, in terms of cancer mortality, a paper in 2008 by David Cutler that shows that innovative treatment have explained the decrease in the deaths per 100,000 inhabitants in the US due to cancer. These are age-adjusted mortality rates, thanks to these new treatments. And there is many other papers that show that this is true in other places, in other countries. But of course, there are diffusion challenges. Diffusion challenges are coming from the fact that the diffusion of innovation can be wide and fast before and after exclusivity period of patent protection. After patent protection, usually generic versions of drugs allow drugs to be marketed at a very low price with competition between generic companies that favor diffusion. But innovative drugs also, their early launch is also desirable before patent expiration. And there are some papers that show that stronger patent protection and fewer price controls allow to have faster diffusion. So of course at a probably higher cost, but faster. So the last point that is important to remember is that the diffusion challenge is going to depend also on the cost of diffusion. And the cost of diffusion is going to be related to the marginal cost of production. As I said before, small molecules that are relatively cheap, can spread very fast, but with biologic drugs, gene and cell therapies that have much higher marginal costs is going to be a challenge for low-income countries to appropriate those innovations. So innovations, of course, requires large R&D. It requires large R&D for different reasons. So first, some drastic innovation are going to depend on fundamental discovery and on late-stage clinical trials. Late-stage clinical trials are going to be there to provide testing evidence of the efficacy and safety of new treatments. And the total investment needed to reach the market with an innovative product is very high because you have very large failure rates. And this is normal. This is due to the fact that we want safe products. And ex ante, you don't know which products are going to be safe enough, are going to be efficient, and you have to try many projects before you innovate. This high failure rate is very costly. So the pharmaceutical sector needs to invest heavily in those projects. And it happens that it's the sector that invests the most among the knowledge-based industries. So if you look at, this is coming from figures from the CBO in the US. If you look at the evolution between 2000 and 2020 of the share of revenue that is invested in R&D in knowledge-based industry, basically the pharmaceutical sector is the one that invests the more. Okay, with currently more than 25% of revenue, which is reinvested in R&D. This is necessary if you want to continue innovating because of the difficulties of finding new treatments. So, and also because of the rising cost of innovation, as I will talk later. So it's not guaranteed that this will continue growing. Okay, maybe it will stabilize, maybe it will go down at some point. With AI, there may be some source of savings, but for now, at least, this is one of the sectors that invests the more. It's a very risky sector also, and you can see, of course, many biotech companies getting bankrupted, and that's part of the total cost for the industry. So, just to confirm what I was saying, pharmaceutical R&D spending has increased by more than 50% between 2015 and 2019, reaching more than $280 billion worldwide in 2024. And this is necessary, again, because the average cost of innovating in a new active ingredient or a new drug is also rising, and it's estimated to be more than $2 billion now. So this expected cost of development, this $2 billion, is due to the fact that there are many projects that fail. And if, for example, you take, these are statistics that I computed recently, if you take all the projects that are in preclinical stage, only 1.5% of those projects will end up in an approved drug. Okay, it's a bit. Of course, once you progress, it's a bit larger because you select more and more. If we had time, I could show you more details. Of course, it's depending on the class of drugs. There are some areas that are riskier than others. But overall, we can see that the innovation in the pharmaceutical sector has been growing recently. So these are numbers since 1995 and until 2024. The blue line is the total number of newly approved drugs worldwide. And the orange one is the one from the US. Okay, so drugs approved by the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration. So you see that this is, of course, varying, but it's been increasing since 15 years quite steadily. And the fact that it's increasing in the worldwide and that the US share relatively becomes less important, even if it's still a majority, is coming from the growth of Asia, in particular China. So here I can show you, so these are the drugs that are approved, so these are the innovation outcome. If you look at the clinical trial projects, okay, you can see, so here the left scale and the vertical scale are different because for preclinical, the numbers are so large that you need to use this scale, which is much larger than this one. What you see is that there is an exponential growth, okay? And this is not coming from Europe, okay? This is coming from Asia. So it's growing everywhere, in Europe, in the US, but Asia is growing very, very fast. What you see is that the projects grow. There is more and more projects in all stages, which is a nice result, and it's a good news. It means that there will be more innovation in the future, but it's also going to challenge even more the financing of the access to innovation in the future. The share of the US is also stable or slightly declining, okay? And even if there are more and more projects, the US domination in terms of number of of projects in development is declining, except for phase 2 clinical trials. So as you know, there are different phases by regulation of our clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 3 is the most expensive one. But the phase 2 is a very important phase that still is done a lot by US companies. So all this development is going to be financed by different tools, different policies. And there are, as I said in the introduction, two categories of policies that we classify sometimes in terms of push incentives, sometimes in pull incentives. I'm going to talk first about push incentives. So the economic rationale for push incentives is that there are some scientific ideas that are difficult to appropriate by firms. And so you need to subsidize the investment in early stage research. So the direct financing of fundamental research is really needed because this cannot be appropriated by the private sector. So you can give many examples of this. This type of push incentives is very important for early investment in research. So typically, grants are important for very uncertain early research, but of course they need thoughtful design. You need to design well the scope, the peer review, the share of the risk, etc. Another type of push incentives, except this type of grants or subsidization of early research or fundamental research, you have subsidies and tax incentives that are quite important. Where the biotech companies can benefit from those incentives to subsidize their investment costs, typically in phase 1 clinical trials, for example. The difficulty with push funding is that it's provided upfront, it's not tied to outcomes, it does not depend on results, and so there is a very large risk of moral hazard in the use of resources. Okay, so you're providing some subsidies for the biotech sectors, but you're not sure that they will use it efficiently in their research, because they can, and there is evidence that some biotech companies just try to survive, even if they know their project is very unlikely to end up in a marketed product. They just try to survive by trying to raise more funds. This issue is complicated to solve, and it creates inefficiency in the push incentives. And so the other disadvantage of push incentives is that you need to spend the money now, okay, and before the ending of the project, and you need to accept failure also. While pull incentives that I'm going to talk about, they have the advantage to depend on the outcome. Okay? So push incentives, I would say, are necessary for very early stage, but they are subject to moral hazard and many inefficiencies. And so there is a consensus that pull incentives are needed, and they come from the expected rewards of innovation. The fact that once you innovate, you're going to have a marketed product, you're going to make a lot of revenue, and this incentivizes the industry and the investors to pay for the R&D cost. These pull incentives, they depend on many things. So they are going to depend on the intellectual property rights and the fact that they are protected in different ways in different countries. They are going to also to depend on the price setting regulation, because if you have very well-defined property rights and very well-defended rights, but very, very low price, the pool incentives are still going to be very small. So these price-setting regulations matter a lot, but also the reimbursement. Because at the end, what matters for the industry is going to be the revenue, and the reimbursement is going to affect the usage of the product. There are many other aspects that affect pool incentives, like advertising regulations, off-label use, merger control. And we'll not have time to detail all of them, but those are important regulations, and they may not be decided in a coordinated way across countries. And finally, the healthcare system organization also affects the total demand and affects those pool incentives. So here in the next two slides, I summarize the most important regulatory events that have happened between the US and Europe since the 80s that affects the push and pull incentives. I don't have a lot of time to detail all of them, but I would say there are a few of them that are very important to remember. The first is the Hatch-Waxman Act in the US in 1984. That has been very important for pool incentives. In 1985, the TRIPS agreement that harmonized the intellectual property rights, the fact that patents in all the countries that are part of WTO are 20 years with some exceptions. Okay, there are some exceptions for pediatric drugs, for other orphan drugs, etc. And more recently, and that I will talk about later at the end, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Most Favored Nation rules, and the General Pharma regulation that was adopted recently in Europe. But all these rules, they matter a lot. So if you look at the slide, you see the biologic regulation also matters a lot. Okay, it has affected the way the biologic industry can recover from its investment, and all this matters a lot. And of course, these different policies are done in an uncoordinated way between Europe and US, without even talking for the rest of the world. So, of course, all these incentives for innovation, they are there because you need them to provide a public good. You need them to incentivize investment in public good. But they necessarily lead to market failures. So the first market failure is coming from the fact that you have a uniform intellectual property rights duration. So the patent of 20 years is uniform, whatever the type of innovation. And there is no reason theoretically that this is the optimal patent protection that you should provide. And so this is going to lead to market failure. So the fact that some rare diseases are not going to be areas where the industry is going to invest a lot, or some diseases where you have low and middle income countries, mostly patients from low and middle income countries. So we need some solutions to solve for these market failures. There has been some solutions with more or less success. So for example, in the US, Orphan Drug Act that extended the patent protection, the exclusivity, market exclusivity of drugs in this area. You have the GAIN Act for antibiotics in 2012 in the US that extended by 5 years the protections in case of innovation for against priority pathogens. These are policies that help, but they don't necessarily solve completely the market failures. So to give these pool incentives, you have alternatives to patents. So you have several types. We have, for example, the advanced market commitments that are famous because of Michael Kramer's paper and the fact that he got the Nobel Prize in 19, I think, because with a few with two other people, but he got it because of this contribution. So the idea of the advanced market commitment is to reward the innovator with some cash prize or some purchase commitment that do not depend on the capacity of the users to pay for the drug. So typically for developing countries. But of course you need an institution to pay or to commit in advance for this advanced market commitment. So if you have a philanthropic institution that does it, or if you have an international organization that does it, that's good. But without this, you cannot have the innovation. There is more recently the adoption of transferable exclusivity extension, especially in Europe for antibiotic research, where basically you're going to incentivize the innovation in areas where the innovation is not profitable because either the size of the number of patients that are going to use the innovation is very small, or the price is going to be also very small, so the revenue is small. You're going to try to delink the revenue of the innovator from the usage of the product. Okay, and one way to do that is to do advanced market commitment. The other way is to use transferable exclusivity extensions, where you're going to reward the innovator by a right to extend an exclusivity that you can trade. Okay, that you can transfer to another product, and in particular to a product where it's very profitable to extend the patent protection or to extend the exclusivity right. So imagine that you innovate in an area with a novel antibiotic that is not going to be used very often, but could save a lot of lives when it's needed, but that so you're not going to make a lot of money with this innovation, but you get this extension exclusivity that you can trade and sell to a blockbuster owner whose patent is going to expire. The blockbuster is going to be able to extend the exclusivity by this time period, and of course pay a lot the innovator, the antibiotic innovator, for that. So we have shown in some research that this could be an efficient way to finance the innovation, and one of the reasons is that, and mostly this is done from a perspective of Europe because this has been adopted by the new pharma legislation in Europe. In Europe, generics markets are imperfect. In many countries, you have regulation, and generics still makes some rent, which is normal in a way, because you want the generic industry to be able to build capacity, etc. But basically, by delaying the entry of generics, you're saving the rent that you otherwise give to the generic industry, and part of this rent can be used to finance the innovation. So in terms of finance, this transferable exclusivity extension can be very positive. Now I'm going to talk about the international dimension and the strategic interdependence. So despite the fact that patent lives have been harmonized by the TRIPS agreements, you still have a lot of national policies that sometimes try to amend the exclusivity periods without clear and international coordination. You have also marketing authorization, pricing, reimbursement, as well as push policies that remain national, and they generate a lot of international spillovers. And finally, you need to have a broad look at the system in order to understand the government policies spillovers. And I'm going to show you in a graph how complicated it can be, because from the drug innovation project to the marketing authorization, you have many places where you can have spillovers across countries. So first, in the drug innovation project, when a firm, and at the time of patent application, okay, you have different phases, you have to invest. These investments are going to depend on the push incentives from different countries, but the private investment is going to depend also on the sales post-marketing authorization that are anticipated by the industry and that depend on all the policies that you may have in different places of the world, in the US, in Europe, as well as in other countries. And all these policies are going to depend on marketing authorization regulations, on pricing regulations, whether it's national price setting, whether you have reference pricing. Also, this is going to be affected by parallel trade, for example, the fact that I'm going to talk later about parallel trade. And all these regulations affect the incentives to invest. So in order to understand all this, you need to have really a very broad perspective. And of course, as you see from this graph, it's very complex. Okay? So I'm not claiming that we are going to solve everything and we are not going to get to the point where we have a world-level regulation and policy. But at least you can see that the less complex systems you have within some regions, in particular within Europe, the more likely you can design rules that are as efficient as possible so that we can make use of our rare healthcare budgets the most efficient way, okay? In the most efficient way. So all this is going to create complexities. You have US FDA, EU EMA, you have many rules. So the international spillovers are going to create complexities, and they can create complexities also for national decisions. So if I take the example of the French regulators that negotiate the price of drugs for prescription drugs in France, this is very complex for this regulator to understand all the different externalities that is going to create because of all these spillovers. But there are also local spillovers. Okay, and local spillovers, in a way, they are good. Okay, they are nice because when they are positive, and here I'm talking about positive local spillovers, they are nice because they are going to save a little bit of the disincentives driven by the international spillovers. So the international spillovers are going to disincentivize every player, every country to invest because the investment is going to benefit others. Okay, so in a way it's going to create more free riding. You're going to wait others to invest before you do it, okay, because you know there are these positive international spillovers. The more local spillovers you have, the better it is because this is going to create incentives to invest because you know that the local spillovers are not going to benefit others. Okay, and there are different sorts of local spillovers. So there has been shown that after the 1980 Bayh-Dole Act that gave universities intellectual property rights over federally funded inventions, it has been shown that US universities have contributed to local growth beyond patenting, beyond licensing and university. So this gives incentives to do local investment because this is not going to benefit others. Of course, the innovation is going to later to benefit others, but all the other benefits of those investments are going to be local. There is a recent paper that also shows that in biomedical research, you can have reduction in mortalities thanks to knowledge spillovers. So the fact that you do clinical trials in a given place is not only going to benefit the participants of the clinical trial now, but also other participants to the healthcare sector because of knowledge accumulation by physicians, pharmacists, etc. So there is an interest in having the clinical trial in your place because these knowledge spillovers are positive. There are also, so basically these are the good local spillovers. The international spillovers, they are good, but they create a lot of free riding problems. So for example, there is a paper by Kyle and co-authors that shows that there is a lot of international free riding in push incentives. So for example, when the US government increased by 10% its funding, it tends to reduce by 2-3% the funding by other governments in other places. So this is typically a bad international spillover. There is another paper by Egan and Philipson that shows that the level of reimbursement determines the size of the pool incentives can be strategic substitutes across countries. So basically, the more you increase the price of this innovative cancer treatment in Europe, the less you will have to pay a high price in the US. So these global returns to medical innovations, they create positive interdependencies between countries' healthcare reimbursement policies. And of course, this is very hard to take into account when you're a national government and want to price innovations. This results in a lot of correlations between price levels, price differences, and launch orders. Okay, so I did some new statistics on that. I don't have time to show you, but this is quite spectacular to see how the ratio of prices between US, Europe, or the rest of the world depend on the order of launches. There are other types of international spillovers that are less known. One of them is what I call learning by doing. So take the example of biological drugs. Biological drugs are very expensive to produce. They have high marginal cost. However, we can show that there is a reduction of marginal cost of these biological drugs by the fact that the more you produce, the more you learn how to manufacture those products. Okay, so that's a learning by doing effect. And this is going to create international positive spillovers, positive in the sense that if a country decides to buy a lot of one of these biological drugs, the companies that produce it will have to increase the capacity of production, will have to produce more, which is going to lower the marginal cost and benefit other countries once they start paying for these new drugs. So unfortunately, this is going to lead to an incentive to wait for countries, to wait for others to first pay the very large marginal cost of the first units because of this learning by doing. And so in the papers that I cite here, we try to estimate the impact of this learning by doing in the production of one class of TNF inhibitors. And what we find is that entry orders, so the fact that you enter in different countries at different places, and demand are going to improve efficiency and generate spillovers across countries on marginal cost. Okay, and so for example, in the paper we show that because some drug has been introduced late in Canada, okay, in Europe we paid higher marginal cost because we were still at the beginning of the learning by doing. Once the Canada enters and buys the drug, you have a lower cost. If Canada had accepted the biological drug much earlier, okay, then we would have paid a lot less. Another type of spillovers across countries is due to drug shortages. So there are externalities across countries that are due to the drug availability and the fact that the capacity of production can be chosen by a company depending on the international demand. In most countries, the price of drugs is relatively rigid. It's not going to affect like for gas, for example, is not going to depend and vary day after day depending on demand and supply. So it's very hard to have short-term price increase that are going to adjust for the fact that the demand may be larger than supply. And there are papers that show that the fact that you value reliability can reduce shortage, but this type of contract is not used very much up to now. And so because of that, it has been shown in the US context, but also in Europe with this paper in France, that the price of drugs affects the probability of shortage. And what is interesting is that within Europe, at least with this paper, we show that the higher the price in France, the less shortage you will have for the drugs in France. Okay? This is kind of intuitive, but this is due to two reasons. One is that not only higher price is going to everything else equal, is going to make the firms willing to sell more in France because the revenue is going to be larger because of this high price. But also higher price is going to create capacity to invest more in larger factories. And this is going to benefit everybody. And so you can show this by the fact that if you look at the role of price in the UK on shortages in France, you can see that when there is a shortage, the fact that the UK price is larger than the French price, and the larger it is, the more shortage you will have in France. Because basically when demand is too large compared to supply, the companies are going to supply first the high price countries. Okay? However, when there is no shortage, the high price allows to build more capacity, and so the probability of a shortage is going to be reduced by the level of the price in any place. So here we did that with UK and France, but basically due to this capacity investment, you can have a positive spillovers on the shortage probability in other places. Another type of spillovers across country is due to international reference pricing. So as you know, this is used a lot in Europe, and now the US is starting to be willing to use it. So within Europe, it has been shown that international reference pricing creates delays in launch. Okay, so the low-price countries in Europe, and typically France is one of them, is one of the low-price countries, have some delays in the launch of new drugs. Why? Because if you are a low-price country, you're going to be used as a reference by other countries, and then the companies don't want, when they enter the high-price countries, they don't want to have a low price in another place that is going to be used as a reference when they negotiate the price of drugs. Because of that, you have delay. Of course, you don't delay forever because the patent clock continues, okay? And so the companies, they still want to sell the drugs before the patent expiration. But it creates some delays that is bad for everybody, not only for the countries that have delays, but also for the industry. Okay, so the ideal situation would be that launch of new products is everywhere in Europe without any delay. But for this, you need to abandon reference pricing. So unfortunately, since recently, the US has tried to introduce most favored nation rules. So it's a sort of international reference pricing with respect to European countries, European plus a few others. And this is going to put a lot of pressure on the price in Europe, basically because the market size of the US is so big that accepting a price decrease in the US is going to be too costly for most pharma companies, and so they will put a lot of pressure in Europe to raise the price. The magnitude is going to depend on the specific structure, but this is a very important worry, and I would say this is not just coming from the current US administration. This is something which is coming since many years in the US. Okay? It was already in the Biden administration with the Inflation Reduction Act, with different versions of the rule, but basically this is a general tendency that we are going to have to face. Within Europe, we have also, and I think I will not give you all the details, we have also the problems of parallel trade. So because of this price difference across countries, you have trade of drugs between a low-price country to high-price countries. This is also detrimental. This creates less price differentiation that we would like to, and it also tends to be costly for everybody. So in a paper published in 2020, we have shown that, and we have shown that banning parallel trade would increase pharmaceutical profits. And you could also have situations where the payers pay less and the industry gain more. And basically, you eliminate parallel traders' benefit. And this is desirable because parallel traders are not investing in R&D, they are just doing parallel trade. And what you want when you spend a lot of money on innovative drugs is to reward the inventors. You don't really want to reward parallel traders. So So finally, I'm going to talk about the impact of all these pull incentives on innovation through what we call the elasticities of innovation to market size. So there are many papers in the literature that show that this elasticity is positive. And basically, you have two classes of papers in this literature. Some that look at the impact of market size, the US market size on innovation, and others that look at the global impact on the world market size on innovation. When you say market size, it means the revenue that the industry can expect. Okay, and this elasticity is positive. The magnitude of this elasticity is very important because this is going to inform us about the trade-off, the optimal trade-off between static and dynamic efficiency. Okay, so the fact that we want to pay a high price today for a drug is just because of dynamic efficiency. We want to incentivize innovation, and we have to improve welfare thanks to that. If we were just having a static perspective, from the static efficiency point of view, you would like the lowest price possible because you want to disseminate the drug to improve access. So there is a trade-off to find in between the two. And this trade-off depends on these elasticities. If this elasticity is very large or very small, you're not going to make the same trade-off. So what I wanted to show finally is some new evidence about the relationship between this market size and innovation by region. Because in fact, the innovation is going to react differently to different regions' revenue. And so what we did here, what I did here in this the paper on which this lecture is based is thanks to data on all the clinical trials, all the innovations, and the revenue from the most important markets, so that I classified between the US, EU, and the rest of the world. I have tried to measure this innovation by looking at the origin of the headquarters of the company bringing the innovation to the marketing authorization, and the revenue from which the company is making money. Okay, so you have a worldwide revenue. A lot of it is coming from US, and the rest is EU and the rest of the world. And you can see how much the innovation reacts to this change in the revenue. So of course you have to be careful with endogeneity, but you can correct for that. So this is just to show you the estimate. So first, here this is overall, this is the elasticity, so it's 0.6, okay? So it means what? It means that the 10% increase in expected revenue worldwide is going to create an increase of drug registration by 5.9% or 6%. But if you look at the source of revenues across countries, you see that the elasticity is mostly worldwide is mostly coming from the US revenue. Okay, it's driven almost only by the US market. But however, if you look now at who responds to which market, so if you classify the firms by the location of their headquarters, US, EU, or rest of the world is mostly Japan, Korea, China. What you see is that the US headquarter firms, they respond mostly to US, a bit less EU increase in revenue. So the larger the expected revenue in those regions, the more they are going to innovate, with a larger response from the US. And if anything, a negative one from the rest of the world. This is a bad spillover impact, in fact. And this is a prediction that you can find in the Egan and Philipson 2013 paper. Okay, the fact that you have this international spillover is going to disincentivize some countries. So when the low-income countries or China and other countries are going to invest more and so spend more on drugs, this could disincentivize those countries. For the EU, it's mostly the same for US and EU, maybe slightly larger for EU, also negative from the rest of the world. Well, if you look at the rest of the world countries, they mostly depend on the rest of the world revenue. Okay, they don't really react to, and it's probably due to the fact that they have a lower access to those. But the most important part is the US, because for now, it's still most of the, more than half of the innovation are still located, invented by US headquarters. But this is going to change, because if you look at the clinical trials that will lead to innovation in 5 or 10 years, you have now a majority coming from China. So the Chinese are going to affect a lot the landscape of innovation. So to conclude, the regulatory environment ranging from intellectual property rights protection, price regulation, push and pull incentives, they shape all the investment in pharmaceutical R&D in a very complex way. At the end, you still have always a key tension between static and dynamic efficiency. The fact that you want to improve access, affordability, but you also want to sustain innovation. And this is complicated by the fact that you have cross-borders or cross-regions spillover effects. Policy interdependence, sometimes very explicit with reference pricing. This creates a lot of issues like free riding, strategic delays in drug launch, fragmented procurement systems, and all this is going to, unfortunately, reduce the effectiveness of the current incentive structures. So, to conclude, I think what all this tells me, at least, is that future policy need to design institutions that are going to try to internalize as much as they can, at least some spillovers. For example, within Europe, this is a place where we could try to internalize those spillovers at least as much as possible. We would try to align incentives across different countries, tailor the funding mechanism. For example, the transferable exclusivity extension is a good thing, advanced market commitments. Basically, we are not going to solve all the issues across US, Asia, and Europe, but at least within Europe, there is a lot to do to improve the system and design better institutions that get rid of the negative spillovers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So maybe I'll start with a question and then I'll invite the audience to ask any questions if you'd like. And I think just touching on those 3 centers of gravity, the US, Europe, and especially China now, I'm curious, if Europe did all of the things that you're mentioning, if your intuition is that the prices still would decrease on average in Europe and would make Europe less competitive in the global landscape, or even if we do all of this and perhaps have a joint HTA and price setting and then some transfers across Europe, we would have to raise prices because that's where especially the US and China's income levels are going, basically. So we will not be competitive. And that will be a huge, of course, concern with aging populations and our relative productivity. So just curious, if we did all of that in Europe, if you think prices would still need to go up?
I think yes. I think it's likely that price of innovative drugs will have to go up, not necessarily of generics, but for innovative drugs, they will have to go up a bit, but they will have to go up much less if we do have a coordinated policy than if we don't. So if we don't, basically, with the MFN policy in the US, we are going to lose access, or we are going to have to pay very, very high price, almost like the current one in the US. And while if you have a coordinated policy at the European level, maybe you will have to pay a bit more, but much less than if we do it country by country. And I think it would be much more efficient to have a centralized procurement system in Europe for drugs that could negotiate the price of drugs. So it's also good for the US, in fact. Okay? Because if we don't have a European policy, then basically we are going to lose access. Or maybe, of course, the Swiss, richer countries are going to pay very high price, and still, but they are small, okay? But a lot of countries will lose access, so the industry revenue will be even more depending on the US. And so the US are going either to have less innovation or to have to spend even more. So even for the US, it's not a good thing if Europe does not coordinate. So I think European coordination is good for Europe, but also for the US. So Hopefully this will happen. So in some contexts, we have managed to do it in the COVID crisis, as I said. But it's not easy because we have a lot of 27 countries in the EU, very different health insurance system. So I think what we need to do is decorrelate the health insurance system from the procurement system. The procurement of drugs and the fact that you negotiate a wholesale price at the European level has to be different from your health insurance system, where richer countries may want to afford and to reimburse some drugs that poorer countries may not, or that poorer countries will not be able to cover at 100%, so we'll ask for more out-of-pocket spending. So we know that in poorer place in Europe, there is more inequality within the country in access to innovative treatments. But this is the price to pay if we want to continue having access. And in the end, this is going to be better than if we don't do this type of policy. So it's complicated, but I think having a more coordinated European level procurement system, like we did for the COVID vaccine, for all the innovative drugs is the only solution. Otherwise, we are going to individually we have to spend even more, or we will lose access.
Thanks so much. Do we have any questions here in the room for Pierre?
Thank you for presentation. So I just wanted to clear out, so for you the solution, if we wanted to have some coordination between the member state of the European Union today, would be maybe, like you said, like if you can kind of clarify what you hear by the idea of splitting like the health insurance system. So like you're saying kind of is like having the health insurance system on the nation level for a reimbursement, and then on the supranational level more like focusing on the how to invest as the European Union rather than like doing a clear. I'm not sure if it's clear. Sorry.
No, yeah, I think I understood. So, in the case of the COVID vaccine, we had a centralized procurement system, and then all countries decided to cover fully the vaccine. Okay, so there was no issue. But you could imagine that you have different coverage rates across countries. Some countries cover 100%, others 90%, others 80%. The other thing you could do is to have some cross subsidies across countries. So you could say, okay, these innovative cancer drugs, we negotiate with this big pharma company, European level wholesale price for this drug of, let's say, 10,000 euros per patient, okay? And then within Europe, we distribute the drug to the patients, and maybe we have the richer countries pay 15, and the poorer countries pay 5,000 per patient. And there are already within Europe some rules of payments that depend on the income, okay, on income level of countries. So this is called sometimes a fair share of contribution. So you could have this type of mechanism where basically we purchase a drug at 10,000 and we have negotiated the price of the drug at 10,000, which you could not do if you were doing individually because you would be too small, and then maybe the Germans would manage to negotiate 15,000, the French 20,000, I don't know, but they would not, because their market is too small compared to Europe, they would not manage to get the 10,000 price. Well, if you negotiate for all Europe with many patients, you would. And then you can help the lower income countries by having a differentiated price with subsidies. But basically the negotiated price for procurement to the company would have to be negotiated in a centralized way. So of course, when you do that, you need a strong institution and commitments, because I think there are economists in the room. The first reaction would be, okay, if the Germans have to pay 15 instead of 10, which is agreed price for Europe, there could be some incentives for the German to go to the company and say, hey, can you sell to me at 11,000? Okay? Which the company would say, okay, why not? And then the German would, okay. So you have to have a strong commitment that each country will pay its fair share. So if it's 15 for the German and 5,000 for the, of course the Greeks are going to benefit from it, and they will not be able to get an even lower price from the pharma company. But those who pay more than the European level negotiated price, they may have an incentive to go to the company and deviate and try to get their own. But this cannot work. So if you anticipate this behavior, the initial agreement cannot work. So you need a strong institution that prevents this type of deviation. And that's not easy. We did that in the case of the COVID vaccine, but there was not this, it was different issue, and it was also a kind of extreme case with kind of exceptional crisis. But I think this centralized procurement is the only solution, and it's beneficial for the industry, for European countries, and for the US.
If I may, here in the back. Thank you very much, Pierre, for the very complex lecture. If I could maybe ask you how would you explain something that to me seems like a bit of a discrepancy. So when I listen to you and the macro world that you paint, it does make sense to me. But then when I dive into the micro world, it somehow doesn't. And what I mean now is that I've been in the health technology assessment field for some time, and when we look at the added value of those innovative products, the innovation that you named there, it's typically relatively small. So in the case of Slovakia over the past 3 years, we looked at the average added qualities, and it was something like 0.7. And there were the big drugs for cystic fibrosis, breast cancer, spinal muscular atrophy. So some of those you would assume will cause that growth in life expectancy. And then it's just not clear to me why should we, and understandably now in terms of the MFN, Europe is trying to be more stricter because we see the relatively little added value of the drugs in a way. And so it's very hard then to argue for the increased willingness to pay if you see the little added value, even though the macro chart will tell you we are having whatever longer life expectancy. So what's your take on this of macro conflict? Thank you.
No, that's a good remark. So, so health technology assessment is complicated, and unfortunately, currently, it's done a lot by different countries in different ways. And so we need also some. So there is a start of harmonization within Europe, but what is? I mean. So now you have HTA, for example, for all the cancer drugs done at the European level. The issue is that each country still wants to keep an eye and keep a right to decide what they want. And so you need a centralization of this HTA. You need it to be well done, of course. You don't want to pay for things that are not very useful. But what is important is that each country relies on this European level HTA and does not do its own evaluation country by country. And for now, that's not yet the case. But yeah, I think this, there are also a lot of externalities in HTA across countries that are detrimental, I would say. HTA is complicated also now with all the novel medicine and all the personalized medicines. It's going to be, we have to develop methodologies for that. So I didn't speak too much about HTA, but it's also a complex issue. Yeah.
So I'm looking. Maybe my final question in that case: what are some of the last or open, unanswered questions in your current research, or things that you would like our younger researchers here to pay attention to? And perhaps, if you could design another ERC group or grant, what would be the things that you would encourage other people to work on in those situations?
Okay, so I already have ideas about my next ERC application. When my ERC will be, when you are lucky enough to get one ERC and you see all the research you can do thanks to it, you want to apply again, and the financing of research in France is also such that we are incentivized and we need to find research money, and so the ERC is extremely useful. And so I already have ideas in mind, but I've done a lot of research on the things that I have presented today about regulation of the pharmaceutical sector, but I think we need more research on the organization of healthcare systems. And this is an area where I'm starting to invest, and if I do another ERC after the current one, I will work on this. So it's extremely complex. It's going to depend on management, labor. It's also related to the training of nurses and physicians, the internal organization of hospitals, relationship between hospitals and insurance companies. I see already, for example, a lot of issues with the way we pay for activity in hospitals, so the famous DRG and activity payments, and the way we constantly update those DRGs because of innovation. And it's very complex, and it creates, usually they are not updated very fast. And so when you have a new treatment for a given cancer, it's hard to update DRG very quickly. It creates a lot of issues about who is going to pay for the innovative treatments for the different patients, etc. And it's related to the organization of hospitals, how you incentivize efforts in quality of treatment and not only efforts in, these are financial organizations. Some private clinics are for profit. So I think this is a very important area. There is some research already done in the US and a bit in Europe, but I think we still need much more. So it's not only how you regulate the pharma sector, you incentivize innovation, etc. So I'm doing a lot in this area, and I plan to continue, and I think it's very interesting. But the next stage is to look more at the healthcare organization, hospitals, etc. So I think if you can do more research in this area, this will be very useful. But it's very difficult and complex. So, as you know, you have the outcomes of an organization like an hospital is multidimensional. So it's very complex to incentivize activity and an efficient use of resource when you have multidimensional outcomes. But we need to do the best we can on this.
Thanks so much, and thank you, Professor Dubois, for a great lecture and also meeting with a good number of the team members today and tomorrow, and for coming out to Brno, so the city of Mendel. Thank you all for coming today. We'll have a little bit of time after the lecture is over to informally greet the professor, and hopefully we'll have a chance to meet with him again, or meet him and his colleagues in Toulouse or other places where health economics is conducted. So thanks so much, and thanks for coming.
You.
Yeah.